The party is over. You are now witnessing the inevitable collapse of a fantasy driven foreign policy, and the event unfolding in the Panama Canal, Iran's tankers and naval assets moving into the Caribbean, is merely a symptom. It is a strategically significant marker, a blunt finger pointing directly at the terminal rot inside the Pentagon and NATO. This is not a failure of courage. It is a fundamental, grotesque failure of doctrine and leadership. For 3 decades, we have allowed our strategic thinking to be hijacked by political operatives, ideologues, and incompetents who confuse media narratives with military facts. The result is the current global strategic quagmire, where a third-rate power like Iran can sail unmolested into America's strategic backyard, leveraging a canal that we foolishly ceded, knowing full well its choke point significance. This entire episode exposes the fatal flaw in the Washington consensus. They believe they can dictate reality, but reality, as always, is a function of military and economic math. Let's be blunt about the math, because that is the only metric that matters in war. The current conflict in Eastern Europe, the one our leadership insists is a victory in the making, is a grinding, savage lesson in attrition warfare that the West simply refuses to learn. Our doctrine, the one preached by the generals who've never heard a shot fired in anger, outside of counterinsurgency mop-up operations, is built on the lie of maneuver warfare, a quick, decisive thrust by high-tech, low-mass forces. It is pure intellectual pornography for the budget planners. The reality? This is a war of steel, shell, and blood, dominated by massed fires, not flanking movements. The West's narrative is crushed daily by the attrition math when a military force requires a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 advantage in personnel to execute an offensive maneuver against a prepared defense, and is, in fact, operating at a 1-to-3 disadvantage in heavy artillery output, as our proxies are, the outcome is mathematically predetermined. It is simply a matter of time and material consumption. The casualty ratios being inflicted upon the U.S.-backed forces are not sustainable. I have consistently stated that a unit degrades in combat effectiveness long before it is destroyed. A 30% combat loss, killed, wounded, captured, or non-battle injury renders a battalion combat ineffective. The numbers we are seeing are not just reaching this threshold, they are cycling through it repeatedly, feeding newly conscripted, poorly trained manpower into a meat grinder that consumes them faster than they can be replaced. This is the industrial reality of war. Our allies and political masters, who possess degrees in law and social sciences, understand neither the logistical tale required to sustain this volume of fire, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells per month, nor the technical manpower crisis created when experienced sergeants and captains are vaporized on the front line. You cannot replace an experienced artillery crew, a technical maintenance team, or a combat-hardened platoon leader with a 2-week training course. This hemorrhaging of experience is the true strategic cost, and it is a cost the West has willfully outsourced to a proxy force it is now rapidly abandoning. What does the Panama Canal movement have to do with this casualty crisis? Everything. The strategic environment is unitary. Washington has spent the last 2 years obsessing over a political border in Eastern Europe while intentionally creating a strategic vacuum elsewhere. Our forces are overstretched, our munitions depots are depleted, empty, not just low, and our political credibility is non-existent. Our adversaries, whether they are operating in the Middle East, the Pacific, or now the Caribbean, are watching our institutional failure in slow motion. They see the West's inability to mass produce basic artillery shells to replace damaged armor, or, crucially, to maintain a credible deterrent posture on a global scale. The deployment of Iranian naval assets, including a refitted oil tanker converted into a military sea base, is a low-cost, high-leverage move. It is a direct strategic taunt in our own hemisphere, aimed at our vulnerable, resource-dependent allies. It forces a strategic reaction, drawing resources and attention away from the pre-existing and already failed main theater. This is the operational trap. The Iranians know our current strategic bandwidth is consumed by the European theater and the Middle Eastern crisis. They know the U.S. Navy is dispersed, and the political will to aggressively intercept an oil shipment is low, precisely because our leadership is terrified of escalating an already fragile global system. The message being sent through that canal is clear: America is distracted, America is weak, and its vital choke points and spheres of influence are now contestable. We have sacrificed our industrial might and our strategic discipline on the altar of political virtue signaling and institutional corruption. The Iranian move is a classic example of an adversary exploiting a strategic distraction, forcing a deployment of scarce U.S. assets, or worse, forcing a humiliation. You do not send strategic naval assets through a choke point like that without a clear intent to test the reaction or lack thereof. The entire strategic concept of the Monroe Doctrine, the bedrock of hemisphere security, is being challenged by a nation our intelligence community dismissed as a regional non-factor. This is not just a naval deployment. It is a profound strategic indictment of an entire generation of Pentagon leadership that could not and would not look beyond the political horizon. They are trapped in their own narratives. The math, the hardware, and the map, however, are unforgiving, and they all point to a singular operational outcome. You cannot win a war by clinging to a doctrine that was invalidated by the technical realities of the First World War. Yet, that is precisely what the entirety of Western military theory, particularly the flavor currently permeating NATO's general staff, has done. We are obsessed with maneuver warfare, the idea of deep penetration, of bypassing enemy strongpoints, and achieving a decisive, quick victory with high-tech, low-mass forces. It is a beautiful theory for a PowerPoint presentation, and it is a technical failure on the modern battlefield. The instant you introduce ubiquitous surveillance drones, commercial satellite imagery, persistent ISR, and precision-guided long-range artillery, the maneuver component of this doctrine becomes suicidal. Any massed armored formation attempting a deep thrust is immediately identified, fixed in place, and annihilated by coordinated fire. This is not 1991. The desert maneuver from Desert Storm cannot be replicated against a peer or near-peer opponent who fields modern sensors and mass tube artillery. The Russian approach, which our generals routinely sneer at, is rooted in the harsh, undeniable truth of the Eastern Front: attrition through overwhelming firepower. Their doctrine is to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight personnel, equipment, and logistics before attempting a deep advance. It is slow, methodical, and profoundly effective against poorly trained and poorly dug-in forces. They use artillery as a siege weapon, softening and destroying fortifications systematically. This is simply the return of historical realism. Go back to World War I. The great offensive movements failed precisely because the defense, armed with machine guns and massed artillery, could always impose a higher rate of attrition. The invention of the tank and combined arms was supposed to break that stalemate, and it did, but only temporarily. The drone age has effectively recreated the conditions of trench warfare, but on a massive dynamic scale, where the trench is often a kilometer deep, mined and fortified line of resistance. The sheer volume of fire required to breach this, the tonnage of destruction, is something the West has deliberately defunded and forgotten how to generate. This doctrinal blindness is directly attributable to the catastrophic lack of technical, tactical, and operational experience at the highest levels of our command structure. Look at the flag officers and the civilian leadership in the Pentagon. How many of them have commanded a brigade combat team in a high-intensity, peer-level conflict? 0. How many have advanced technical degrees in engineering, logistics, or physics? A handful, often marginalized. The upper echelons are dominated by lawyers, social scientists, political appointees, and careerists focused on promotion metrics that have nothing to do with fighting and winning wars. They speak the language of diversity and inclusion, strategic messaging, and information superiority, all things that crumble into dust The moment a modern $5,000 FPV drone, controlled by a kid 10 kilometers away, vaporizes a $10 million main battle tank. The inability of a political leader, often a lawyer or a politician, to grasp the sheer physics and logistics of moving, supplying, and sustaining a heavy mechanized force against sophisticated opposition is not a minor oversight. It is the single greatest cause of institutional failure. They believe money and narrative are substitutes for mass and fire. They are dangerously wrong. This intellectual incompetence is why they misjudged the entire conflict. They expected the Russian military to operate according to the neat, stylized playbook of Western maneuver doctrine, anticipating a swift collapse. When the Russians reverted to their core, historically proven doctrine, massed fire, strategic depth, and industrial endurance, Washington was left dumbfounded and intellectually paralyzed. They cannot pivot because their entire conceptual framework is built on sand. They keep demanding breakthroughs from their proxy forces, forcing them into suicidal, localized offensives that only serve to amplify the attrition rate. They are sacrificing their own credibility in the lives of others for the sake of a positive political spin, proving that political competence has been entirely decoupled from military success. I often reference the devastating strategic consequences of ignorance. When leaders lack the technical knowledge, they become dependent on and vulnerable to the sales pitches of the military industrial complex, which is the perfect segue into the corruption we will cover next. But understand this: the foundation of our current strategic collapse, the reason we are surprised by Iranian moves in the Caribbean and devastated by attrition in Europe, is the intellectual betrayal of our own military professionalism. We have allowed soft thinkers to lead hard men into impossible situations. They cannot calculate the rate of fire, the minimum replacement cycles for armor, or the strategic importance of a reliable supply of basic, unglamorous ammunition. They confuse the appearance of strength, such as a high profile but low utility naval deployment to some friendly port, with the actual capability to project decisive power. The Panama Canal situation, again, is the physical manifestation of this doctrinal failure. A competent, technically grounded military strategist would view the U.S. hemisphere security as paramount and non negotiable, supported by a rapid, self sustaining industrial base. The current leadership views it as a secondary theater, a distraction from their self imposed, politically convenient obsession in Europe. By prioritizing a doomed, maneuver based proxy conflict, they have ceded the initiative globally. They have allowed their arsenals to be drained of essential stocks that take years to replace, and they have created a strategic environment where nations like Iran feel emboldened enough to poke the behemoth with a converted tanker. This is the bitter fruit of believing in politically correct theories over the technical, bloody truth of history. The history books, if anyone in Washington bothered to read them, are clear. Wars of attrition are won by the side with the deepest reserves of political will, industrial capacity, and most importantly, the strategic patience to endure and inflict more destruction than they receive. The West currently lacks all three. The failures I've outlined, the attrition math and the doctrinal incompetence, are not accidental. They are the systemic products of institutional corruption, a disease that metastasized within the Pentagon and NATO immediately after the Cold War. We replaced the focus on military competence with a system predicated on political compliance and the servicing of the military industrial complex, MIC. Today's flag officers are overwhelmingly political commissars dressed in expensive uniforms. Their careers are not made by winning fights, but by managing budgets, cultivating congressional sponsors, and adhering to politically fashionable narratives. They are rewarded for pushing through multi-billion-dollar programs that are technically flawed but politically expedient. This is the fundamental corruption: profit over performance. The MIC is a powerful lobby, a self-licking ice cream cone designed to maximize quarterly returns, not battlefield effectiveness. We spend trillions on defense, yet the result is a system that fields enormously expensive, exquisitely complex weapons platforms that are too few, too fragile, and often too late to the fight. Consider the Patriot missile system. It is a system sold globally as the ultimate air defense shield. Yet, its performance in recent conflicts, particularly against cruise missiles and more advanced platforms, has been wildly oversold. The cost exchange ratio is catastrophic. Firing a multi-million-dollar interceptor to shoot down a relatively cheap drone or aging missile is a losing proposition, a logistics and financial death spiral. We cannot manufacture these interceptors fast enough, nor can our allies afford the volume required to maintain continuous, credible defense against massed attack. This system is designed to generate vast profits for its manufacturers, not provide sustainable security for the nations relying on it. Contrast this with the material reality of conventional ground warfare, which, as I've stated, is determined by artillery, armor, and logistics. For decades, the West has deindustrialized. We cannot today surge the production of 155 millimeters artillery shells, the most fundamental component of modern warfare, to meet the demand of even a medium-sized conflict. The production lines do not exist. The skilled labor base has been eroded. Meanwhile, our adversaries, who were dismissed as backward, possess industrial economies of scale that dwarf our current capabilities in producing basic steel and shell casings. This industrial weakness is the ultimate technological gap, and it's not in the realm of stealth bombers. It's in the mundane, brutal necessity of mass production. Now, let's talk about the actual technological gap, which is rapidly shifting against the West due to our focus on incremental, profit-driven upgrades rather than revolutionary strategic capability. While the Pentagon was busy chasing the next iteration of the F-35, a program that has become a $1.7 trillion monument to complexity and compromise, Russia and China invested heavily in systems designed to fundamentally undermine American power projection. Look at hypersonics. The sheer speed and maneuverability of systems like the Kinzhal or Zircon missiles render our current generation of missile defense practically obsolete. There is no counter to a warhead traveling at Mach 9 that can change course in terminal flight. This capability effectively neuters the carrier battle group, the cornerstone of U.S. global dominance, by putting it at profound, non-defendable risk from thousands of miles away. Furthermore, consider the strategic implication of systems like Poseidon, the nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed autonomous torpedo. It has unlimited range and the ability to carry a massive warhead designed to create tsunamis or radioactive contamination in coastal cities. This is a game changer of the highest order, a truly revolutionary strategic deterrent. The West, having become complacent and fixated on politically palatable conventional wars, completely missed this pivot in strategic technology. We traded genuine, game-changing military advantage for political narrative and shareholder value. The Pentagon budget is not a spending plan for defense. It is a corporate welfare fund that has produced a military that is simultaneously the most expensive and, relative to its strategic challenges, the least capable in decades. The consequence of this institutional failure is clear. The current conflict is draining our already depleted arsenal while providing no strategic benefit. Our forces are trained to fight a high-tech war against a disorganized enemy, which is not the war we face. The political leadership, trapped by their own incompetence and the MIC's lobbying, cannot articulate a realistic path to victory, or, more importantly, a path to peace that acknowledges the military facts on the ground. They are forced into increasingly reckless escalation, attempting to compensate for their lack of basic industrial capacity with dangerous strategic risk-taking. The Iranian move through the Panama Canal is successful because our industrial and strategic capacity is being consumed by a corrupt, politically managed conflict in another theater. The ability of any adversary to tie down U.S. resources and expose our vulnerability, whether through a $5,000 drone or a converted oil tanker, is the ultimate measure of the Pentagon's systemic, corrupt failure. The preceding discussion on technological gaps and institutional corruption leads us inevitably to the highest strategic risk: nuclear escalation. The political establishment in Washington insists that we can manage escalation, that we can keep this war confined to a conventional domain. That belief is delusional, dangerously naive, and ignores the precise historical steps that led us to this precipice. The current global instability is fundamentally rooted in a strategic betrayal committed in 2002. The unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the Anti Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty, signed in 1972, was the bedrock of strategic stability. It codified the understanding that both the U and the Soviet Union would remain vulnerable to each other's nuclear retaliatory strike, thereby ensuring mutual assured destruction, need, and critically deterrence. By building robust missile defenses, you signal an intention to achieve strategic superiority, the ability to launch a first strike and then defend against a weakened retaliatory response. This is profoundly destabilizing. When the U.S. withdrew from the ABM Treaty, claiming it needed to defend against rogue states, the strategic message sent to Moscow was unmistakable. We are seeking a first strike advantage. This forced Russia's hand. As a strategic realist, I recognize that any nation facing the elimination of its nuclear deterrent must, by necessity, invest in systems designed to circumvent the emerging American missile defense shield. This is not aggression, it is pure strategic defense. They knew they could not compete with the U.S. financially on complex missile defense architecture, so they leveraged physics and engineering to develop unavoidable offense. This strategic compulsion is why Russia invested heavily in the very weapons I mentioned: hypersonics and nuclear-powered systems like the Burevestnik cruise missile or the Poseidon torpedo. These systems are explicitly designed to defeat layered ballistic missile defense systems. They restore strategic deterrence by ensuring that a retaliatory strike will always get through. The 2002 ABM withdrawal did not make the U.S. safer. It instigated a new, far more dangerous arms race that has made the prospect of a low-yield nuclear exchange tragically plausible. The current conflict is the direct, tragic payment of the bill for that short-sighted strategic decision. Now, let's look at the current nuclear red line, which is shockingly blurred by conventional capability. I am referring to the Tomahawk cruise missile. The West is supplying long-range strike capabilities to its proxy forces. The Tomahawk, specifically, is a dual-capable weapon. It can carry a conventional warhead or a tactical nuclear warhead. This presents an existential, minute-to-minute crisis for the receiving nation's strategic command structure. If a conventionally armed Tomahawk is launched from an ally's territory toward a critical Russian target, how can the Russian strategic system reliably distinguish it from a nuclear variant during the few minutes of flight time? The answer is strategically. They cannot afford to differentiate. The risk of miscalculation is astronomically high. Any strike against Russian deep strike targets, strategic command and control nodes, or most critically Russian territory using these dual capable systems instantly raises the nuclear risk to its maximum level. This is why the movement of Iranian vessels through the Panama Canal and the associated U.S. strategic distraction is so reckless. It is the height of incompetence to engage in an attritional, unwinnable proxy war in one theater while simultaneously depleting conventional deterrence and creating strategic vacuums in others. The political leaders who authorize the transfer of long-range, dual-capable systems are operating in a state of profound strategic denial, believing the other side will adhere to their self-imposed conventional rules. History demonstrates the opposite. When faced with existential conventional defeat, nations reach for their ultimate deterrent. The leadership that failed to understand the mathematics of attrition is the same leadership that fails to grasp the physics of nuclear escalation. They see the Tomahawk as a useful conventional hammer. The adversary sees it as a potentially terminal threat that requires a first-use response to preempt a potential nuclear strike. We have willfully eliminated the fire breaks that kept the great powers from direct confrontation for half a century. We abandoned the ABM Treaty. We pushed a military alliance right up to the historical strategic depth of a major power, and we are now feeding them dual capable delivery systems. The irony is bitter. The institutional corruption that sold us expensive failed missile defense systems is the same corruption that is now pushing us toward a confrontation that no defense system can survive. This isn't strategy, it's a terrifying, high stakes gamble run by amateurs. The military facts on the ground, the unrelenting attrition, the technological gaps, and the escalating nuclear risk will inevitably lead to political collapse. The failure of military strategy is never isolated. It is the catalyst for domestic and geopolitical instability. We are already seeing the early tremors. In Europe, the relentless commitment of material and funding to an unwinnable conflict is creating profound fiscal and political distress. NATO unity is a fiction maintained by the political class. As the military outcome becomes undeniable, the political leadership in Brussels and various capitals will be forced to confront the colossal cost of their incompetence. We can expect a cascade of political crises, the collapse of ruling coalitions, the rise of populist movements demanding an immediate cessation of funding, and a deep, aggressive fracturing of the transatlantic alliance. When the money runs out and the political capital is spent, the political collapse will follow the military one with brutal speed. Countries that hemorrhage their basic stockpiles for a failed proxy war will realize they have left themselves defenseless, exposed to the Iranian vessels sailing their trade routes and to the strategic consequences of a hostile peer power now fully mobilized. The ultimate lesson here is the unavoidable consequence of denial. The West is being defeated not by superior strategy, but by its own inability to accept military and technical reality. We chose to fight a war of choice, funded by debt and driven by a fantasy of quick, high-tech victory. The adversary chose to fight a war of necessity, underpinned by massed industrial output and historical military doctrine. The outcome was never in doubt once the attrition math was established. The final choice for the West is now stark and unavoidable. You can choose acceptance and reform. This means an immediate cessation of hostilities, acknowledging the existing military reality, massive institutional cleansing within the Pentagon to purge the political appointees and careerists, and a radical reinvestment in basic, sustainable industrial and military capacity aimed at defending our actual interests, not prosecuting doomed foreign wars. This requires strategic restraint, something utterly foreign to the Washington consensus. Or you can cling to denial and collapse. This involves doubling down on failing policies, escalating the conflict with ever more dangerous weapons transfers, accelerating the industrial depletion, and guaranteeing the systemic collapse of political institutions and the strategic order. The move by Iran into our sphere of influence through the Panama Canal is the visible result of that denial, a distraction we cannot afford because our primary military capacity is already committed to failure. I will not mince words. The military machine of the West is broken. It is being hollowed out by corruption, managed by incompetence, and directed by ideologues. We are at a moment of profound danger, not because of the enemy's strength, but because of our own strategic weakness and willful blindness. The only path forward that preserves any vestige of Western power and security requires immediate and aggressive strategic realism. Demand accountability. Purge the incompetence. Reform the Pentagon.